Thank you all for coming out. Tonight I'd like to talk about content strategy of civil discourse, turning conflict into collaboration. My name is David Dylan Thomas. I'm principal of content strategy at Think Company, which is an awesome place to work. I don't mind plugging them because I love working there and they're awesome. And I'm not just saying that because someone else who works here is there. If you want to tweet at me, I'm at movie_pundit. And if you want to, if you're prone to tweet during talks, the hashtag is civil content. But I'd like to start with a fun little experiment. This is an experiment you can do yourselves if you have access to an audience or two. So what you do is you show this photo to an audience, and you ask the audience, should this person drive this car? And what you will get is a policy discussion. And what you will learn is who is on what side, right? We'll have some people saying, oh, old people are terrible at everything. No, they absolutely shouldn't drive. Other people will say, oh, that's ageist. Of course they can drive. People can do what they want. This is America. And back and forth and back and forth. But all you'll know at the end of that conversation, if you know anything, is who is on what side. You can show this same photo to another audience and ask them, how might this person drive this car? What you will get is a design discussion. And what you will learn at the end is several potential options for how that person might drive that car, right? Maybe we have to change the way that the dashboard is configured, or move the clutch up, or change the shape of the steering wheel. But you'll have solutions. Now, online we are very, very, very good, very well versed in the should conversation, right? We know how to do that. We've mastered that. And it's about all we do. What we're not so good at, and what I want to talk about tonight, is that how conversation, that design conversation, and what kind of design choices we can make to make it easier to have that conversation. So the example I gave you, and this is an actual experiment that people have run, comes from a guy named David Bornstein, who is one of the founders of the Solutions Journalism Network. They actually have a representative here in Philly. And the Solutions Journalism Network basically posits that journalism has a couple different jobs. One of those jobs is to point out when people are doing it wrong, right? When there is malfeasance. This is an extremely important function of journalism. But solutions journalism posits that is not the only function of journalism. Journalism should also point out when people are doing it right. What are the positive outliers that are actually repeatable, right? There's this one school system that seems to always have good grades. What are they doing? Is it repeatable? That's important news too. And they try to focus on coming up with a toolkit and a set of parameters around how to do that journalism better. And for them, it's the how story. How did they do it? How can someone else do it too? And this quote kind of frames out a lot of the things I want to talk about tonight. So this is a quote from Robert Fursch, who's the president of the Convergence Center for Policy Reform, or Policy Resolution. I'll talk more about them later, but essentially their job is to get people who would never, ever, ever talk to each other to get to the same table together and actually hash out solutions. And his quote is that over a period of years, I kept meeting people of great decency who had different worldviews. But there wasn't a place where they could meet to bring out the best in each other and find answers that each hadn't considered. The key terms here are people of great decency. One of the things we tend to assume about the people who are on the other side of an issue from us is that they have no decency, right? That doesn't even occur to us that that's a possibility, and they may think the same of us. But there wasn't a place, right? The location is actually very, very important. One of the things we'll talk about tonight is how the environment, whether it's a digital environment or a physical environment, influences the conversation you're going to have. Bring out the best in each other. And again, that supposes there is a best to be brought out, which again is not an assumption we often make about people we disagree with. And finally, hadn't considered. And this is probably the key one. Because again, there's this idea that you, entering into this argument, have perfect information. There's nothing for you to learn. There's nothing you haven't considered yet. He's saying, no, let's actually make that part of the conversation, that there's something neither of us knows yet that we're going to discover by having this discussion. So this Thunderdome is pretty much what we think of, right? What our environment for having these conversations now. This is what we have to work with in most cases when we are going to have these kinds of conversations. And it's very much two men or one man leave, right? We think of political discourse very much right now as a zero-sum game. There is going to be a winner and there is going to be a loser, and it better not be me. A lot of this comes back to a fundamental cognitive bias. And I'm going to warn you now, I'm going to talk about cognitive bias a lot. I do a whole podcast about it called the Cognitive Bias Podcast, so we're going to keep coming back to it. But one of the most fundamental is the fundamental attribution error. This is actually my wife's favorite cognitive bias. And what it basically says is, I'm okay, something's wrong with you. A great example would be if you were, you saw somebody run a red light, and you might think, ah, what a scofflaw, right? That person's a terrible driver, they're inattentive, there's something wrong with them, and that's why they ran that light. If you run a red light, oh, I was in a hurry, I had to get to work, I had an emergency, I got distracted, right? The external circumstances are why you did what you did. But if it's somebody else, there's no such thing as external circumstances, there's just them. You're making the fundamental error of attributing their behavior to them and their personal flaws, and not even thinking about their external circumstances. This is how we enter into a lot of political discourse. So if you are interested in this sort of thing, by the way, there is an even far better podcast than mine called the You Are Not So Smart podcast. And one day he started out his podcast with a quote from George Carlin. It's a routine that goes something like, anybody who drives slower than you is an idiot. Anybody who drives faster than you is a maniac, right? But you, oh, you're driving exactly the right way. Now, think about that. When it comes to political discourse, anybody who is more conservative than you, oh, they're a bigot, right? They want things to be like 1950. They're bad. Anybody who's more liberal than you, oh, they're some kind of hippy-dippy, trippy, like, you know, you're crazy town, right? But you are God's perfect creature. You have figured it all out. You know exactly where this country should go and exactly what policies people should follow. If only they would just listen to you, everything would go so perfectly. Now, if that's how you enter into a discussion with someone, what are the odds that you'll actually hear each other and have a conversation when you've already decided that you're right and there's nothing more to discuss? Instead, what we get is outrage. Now, this is prior to Trump, right? This is 2014. Slate had this wonderful infographic that basically for every single day of the year 2014, they were able to pretty easily find one thing that the internet was losing its shit over. So they were able to you can sort of click on any one of these days in this weird little advent calendar and find here's what they were losing it over today, right? And then vote. Should they have been outraged? Maybe they shouldn't have, right? But there was so much outrage that you can just go to Twitter, throw a stone, and find something people are going crazy over. Around that same time, John Oliver created a website called Scream Into the Void. And what you do is you think about the thing that you're outraged about, you type it in, and then you hit the scream button, and you actually hear, ah, and the words go spiraling into the void. This is a public service. People need this. People need to vent. And the nice thing about it, at least there's no human on the other end of it. So this is it, right? This is why we invented the internet, right? It's where you go to find people who are doing it wrong, and then tell them they're doing it wrong, right? This is our primary use case for the internet. Here's a perfect example. How many people remember this? So, for some reason, I still don't completely understand, Starbucks decided they wanted to have a conversation with us about race. And the way they were going to do it was, someone would write #RaceTogether on your coffee cup, and you'd get your coffee, and then, I don't know, talk about Rodney King. I don't actually know what was supposed to happen at that point in the transaction, right? And I don't think they did either. So of course, Twitter went insane, right? And rightly so. There are so many things wrong with this, right, that we could spend the rest of the day talking about it. But here's the thing. At no point did we really talk about, okay, clearly that was not the way to have a discussion about race. But what is actually a good way to have a discussion about race? Like, what are we comparing it to? Like, we didn't really have this discussion. If we had, we could actually have that discussion and say, well, let's talk about how do we get to a good, productive conversation about race? What does that actually look like? So, what if I could actually go somewhere and order a conversation about race? What if that was the product? Which is sort of weirdly how Starbucks was framing it. But this is Ronnie Polaneczky. She set up a couple chairs in Rittenhouse Square, and through a whole series of events, which you can learn about in her TEDx talk, TEDx Philly talk actually, she got to this point where she realized people need to be heard. This is just a fundamental human need. So she set up 2 chairs in Rittenhouse Square and put up a sign that said, "I will listen with compassion, without judgment, with an open heart. So, is there something you need to say? Tell me, I will listen." And person after person after person sat down and talked to her. And it's kind of funny, the cadence went something like, they would sit down and say, "I don't want to take up much of your time." And then an hour later, right, they were finished unburdening themselves. But she keyed into something, this basic human need. She literally set up conversation as a service. And in fact, there's a Starbucks in Ardmore I went to once, and I saw a rabbi had set up a little sign that said, "I am a rabbi, ask me anything." So that's maybe a step closer to having a conversation about culture in a Starbucks. But these things are there. So part of the reason, right, that we like this vitriol, that we fuel it, one of the theories anyway as to why it keeps getting proliferated is it has value. It has dollar value to make people angry and make people click on things. One of the problems with this approach, however, is that argument then replaces community. If the internet is supposed to be a place where we can come together and talk to each other, this makes it more likely we're just going to argue with each other, right? And that has less value. Part of the reason it has less value is it kind of substitutes yelling for action. So there's a reason he said, don't boo, vote, right? For the most part on the internet, we're booing. We're not taking action. Now that's not to say that outrage in and of itself is not important. In fact, it can be very important. So this is Philadelphia Airport not long after the refugee ban was first announced. And I don't want this talk to turn into, oh, boo social media. Facebook is terrible, Twitter is terrible, because guess what? You don't get this without Facebook and Twitter. Those were key tools used to organize people to show up. And, to be fair, they didn't just show up to boo, lawyers showed up to write things down and get people out of airports, right? Action was being taken too. Some of the same organizers behind this were also behind this. So this is the Women's March, the first one, right after the inauguration. And again, Facebook was crucial to making this possible. In fact, this is the person who did it. Teresa Shook is a woman living in Hawaii. The day after, I believe, the election, she creates a Facebook group called Women's March on Washington. It gets picked up and eventually gets to the point where what happened happened. So it's not that outrage doesn't have value, and it's not that these social media platforms don't have value, but if they don't lead to action, they can be counterproductive. But here's the thing about that clickbait. Here's the thing about that outrage. So they did a study once of why people share content. And one of the things they discovered, this is out at Stanford, one of the things they discovered was that arousal emotions cause people to share. They make them more likely. If they're feeling an arousal emotions are basically any emotion that increases your heart rate, increases your physiology, right? So anger, right? That gets your heart pumping faster. But so does joy. So does hope. So does wonder, right? Those things make it more likely to share. Depression, sadness, things that make your heart beat slower, you're less likely to share. So they thought, huh, that's interesting. And then they said, what if it's not actually the emotion at all? So they had a group of people get on a treadmill, run for a while, about 20 minutes, and then share it, or look at content and decide whether or not to share it. Then they had another group of people sit on their butts for 20 minutes, show a bunch of content, decide whether or not to share it. The people who ran were more likely to share content no matter what emotion it aroused than the people who just sat on their butts. So really, if we can just get everybody working out, they'll be sharing all the content you need, right? But think even more fundamentally about deciding that anger is the emotion you want to use to sell. Said nobody ever, right? So I think there's a fundamental flaw in how we're thinking about monetizing outrage. And I think that over time, we're going to see whether or not this pans out. And I used to work in publishing and used to work with people who were trying to sell ads against clicks, against this, against that. And there was never a through line to, oh, you sold this many ads and this is how much product we moved, right? There was never a clear through line to actual dollar value based on these click-throughs. And I'm still not seeing much research that's supporting it either. So I feel like this might be short-term, but time will tell. So when we think about the design that leads to outrage, that leads to the lack of discussion, we have to think about the fact that design does matter in the first place. That it isn't just the topic, it isn't just the content, it's actually how you're presenting it. So some of the ideas I'm going to be talking about today are, were first raised a decade ago by a very smart man named Derek Kowalczyk, who literally wrote the book on design for a community. It is called Design for a Community. Amazon, as an example, used to just show the reviews, whatever the most recent review was first. And here's the problem with that. We humans are very simple creatures. If you put something at the top of the page, we will simply assume it is the most important thing. It is the thing that I need to give the most weight to, right? All you're really learning by having it at the top of the page in that case is that it's the most recent review. There's nothing more authoritative about that review than any of the other reviews on that page, but I'm going to assume so because it's the first thing there. So they created this notion of helpful. Was this review helpful or not? So the most helpful review now was at the top of the page. But there was still a problem because if it was a positive review, well, I just assumed that that's the thing at the top of the page, it's most authoritative, therefore it must be a good product, right? And completely discount everything else on the page. So then, they moved up the most helpful positive review and the most helpful critical review. And now they're forcing you to acknowledge, because of the fact that they are right next to each other and have the same visual weight, visual authority, that there is a positive aspect to this and a not positive aspect to it, and you have to give them equal attention. All right, so the design is telling you where your eye should go. The design is telling you what you should be paying attention to, what authority you should be giving this content. Similarly, 5-star rating, right? Used to be just whatever the rating was and that's it. But they realized that's not the whole story. They added the histogram, this thing that says how many people gave it 5 stars, how many people gave it 4 stars. Because there's a very big difference than something that's getting 3 stars because there are a lot of 5-star reviews and a lot of 1-star reviews, or something that's getting 3 stars because there's a lot of 3-star reviews, right? Just seeing 3 stars doesn't tell you anything about that. All of this creates context now for the conversation that goes on below. Even color can influence this. So there's a famous experiment, I want to say from the 50s or 60s, where they showed people pictures of stereo equipment, an ad for stereo equipment. And some of the ads had a blue background and some of the ads had a red background. The ads with the red background, people were able to recall details about the stereo, all the little bullet points for how many hertz, I don't know stereos, but whatever those details are. People who had it with a blue background sort of remembered more the feel, almost like the intellectual side, right, of the stereo, and what kind of emotions it was supposed to provoke. So red is very much a, the whole thing about red in a bowl is actually a myth, but it's what you think that is true for us. So we see red, we focus in, right? We go into fight or flight, all of that. And it sort of makes us hyper-attentive, hyper-focused, right? We focus in on the details. We get very, very specific. Blue is cool, intellectual. You start to think. You have time to pause and ponder, right? So if you're trying to design a website or a conversation space where people are supposed to think before they speak, which color do you think you should be going with? Which, by the way, I have no idea why we're red today. I was thinking about that on the way, and I'm like, oh, I'm just going to make people mad.
Yeah, they make us focus.
Exactly, there you go. So saying that the design of a website should influence the quality of conversation may not seem intuitive until you think about the design of actual physical spaces, right? So if I walk into a restaurant and there's beautiful china on the table and a nice chill mood and nice music playing in the background, everything is clean and orderly, this is not the place where I feel comfortable dropping the F-bomb very loudly, right? That doesn't come to mind. It's the first thing I should do. If I walk into a dingy bar, right, everything's kind of dirty, smelly, there's very loud music playing, I might actually feel encouraged, like the space wants me to drop the F-bomb, right? So the spaces actually influence the conversation. So if I look at Medium, and I look at their color choices and their font choices, and everything is beautiful, right? These beautiful spaces, right? I'm going to probably police myself a little more and try to raise myself to the level of that design. If I'm looking at YouTube, there's nothing about this design that says I should behave, right? There's nothing about this design that says I should think of something clever to say. Ditto for Reddit, right? There's nothing here that's telling me, oh yeah, I need to up my game. What I'm being told is we put the least amount of effort into how this place looks. You should put the least amount of effort in how you conduct yourself. Another myth around uncivil discourse is the anonymity myth. So there's probably some ways that anonymity gives us a feeling that we can say what we want, but there's just as much you're allowing for people who don't feel like they're allowed to speak, right, or they might get repercussions for speaking, that anonymity is actually good for social justice. Problem is, even when people use their real names, they can be absolutely horrible. So there was a TED Talk that Monica Lewinsky gave. The comment section, and you do have to use your real name on TED, was absolutely terrible. Ask Emily McManus about this sometime. She's the editor of TED. She's actually a local affiliate. But she can tell you stories about just how they had to shut this down, like how horrendous those comments got with people using their real names. So the anonymity isn't going to save you, but what helps is setting the standard and saying, this is, in fact, what we expect you to do when you're on this site. If you want your comment approved, if you're moderating comments, or if you don't want to get blocked, if you're blocking people, make it clear, this is the standard. And this is good for two reasons. One, if you do end up having to kick somebody off your forum, you can point to this and tell you this is why you were kicked off. And if anybody else does this, the same thing's going to happen. But it also lets you, the content creator, know this is what we're going to live up to here. This is why we're here. This is why we're doing what we're doing. Let's all agree this is the standard we want to achieve. And that kind of alignment, frankly, isn't very common. So I want to talk for a minute about collaboration versus hierarchy. Because a lot of these design choices will come down to which of these you're supporting. So hierarchy is a way of approaching these conversations, right? Basically says, okay, we know how it should be, right? It's that fundamental attribution error. I'm God's perfect creature, I figured out. We know how it should be. This is the standard, no deviation, right? It already knows the answer, right? We figured it out already. And it's exclusive, right? Basically, if you agree with me and this perfect thing I've decided, you're with me, you're in the in-group. And we all get together and talk about how right we are. Anybody who disagrees, well, they're in the out-group, right? You don't get to be a part of us. In fact, we're going to talk about you and how terrible you are, right? It's sports teams. That's all it is. And it doesn't learn anything. It already knows. We've already come to the conclusion that this is the right way to do it. There's nothing else to learn. Collaboration says, here's a problem that we can solve together, right? And it isn't ever actually done. It isn't ever actually satisfied. It's continuously saying, okay, we made it better, but you know what? I bet this could be even better. Let's keep going. It's inclusive, right? Because now, because we haven't already found the answer, we need to find out other people might have an insight, right? There's no in-group, out-group. There's just people we haven't talked to yet. And it's learning, right? It's continuously learning. How we talk about race today is hierarchical, right? And I'm going to preface this by saying I am not excusing racism. I am not saying people should go out saying racist things. They really, really shouldn't. What I am actually saying is there are some flaws in just stopping there. So this is basically what we're good at right now when it comes to racial discussions. We are very good at calling out bad actors and saying, you did wrong, that was wrong, you should not have done that, which, again, very important that we continue to do that. But if we stop there, we're going to have a problem. One of the problems is that if you just smack everybody down when they do this, you basically end up treating noobs like trolls, right? What I mean by that is, if you're going to speak meaningfully about race, it is a skill. You are not born knowing how to talk about race. You just aren't. It is a skill. And like any other skill, right, the only way you get good at a skill is to practice. The problem is Twitter is practicing in public. And Twitter allows no room for error, right? I can't look at a racist tweet and know if that person really meant to cause harm or is just terrible at talking about race, right? I can't tell if they're unskilled or if they're malicious. Twitter doesn't allow me to find that out. And generally speaking, whichever of those is true, Twitter's going to bring the hammer down as if you were there to be malicious. Now, that would be all good and well if we didn't care if people ever got better at talking about race. But if we actually want people to get good at that, let's imagine that I'm trying to teach you how to drive a car. And all I do, I don't speak, all I do is I hit you when you do something wrong. How long is it going to take for you to actually learn how to drive that car? Right? You will never learn how to drive that car. You're going to say, you know what, cars aren't for me. I'm just not going to drive. Right? And a lot of people are opting out of the discussion of race because they're like, you know what, I'm not even going to, let's just never talk about it. Right? And I think we all know never talk about it doesn't work. So the outreach ecosystem we've got only tells you what not to do. Now, one of the aspects of the early web, and a guy named Clive Thompson wrote a very good book about this called Smarter Than You Think. One of the great aspects of the early web was when people talked about technology, right? They would go on their blogs and they would talk about technology. They would have these unfinished thoughts, right? They were actually using the web to think out loud about technology. And as a result, they made great advances and innovations in technology because one person could pick up that thread, oh, have you considered this? And all of a sudden, we got Facebook, right? You can't think out loud about race. You just can't, right? But if you can't, then you don't get that same innovation, right? You don't get that same collaboration of ideas and aspects and things that, oh, I hadn't considered that before. Here's a question. What is the opposite of a racist?
Raceful. Raceful.
Okay, best answer so far. We do not have the language to describe what we want. Guess what happens when you don't have the language to describe what you want? You don't get it, right? We've got plenty of words to describe what we don't want. And they're pretty important words, but they're only half the journey, right? Here's what happened when I decided, I do a podcast about the role of race in different movie genres. And I decided, I wonder what would happen if I Googled what films will make me less racist. This is what I got, right? This is the exact opposite of what I asked for, right? As a content strategist, this is like anathema. This is the worst thing ever, is for the information I asked for to not only be unavailable, but no, I'm giving you the opposite of what you asked for. But this is a perfectly predictable result because, again, all the content we have is about what not to do, not what to do, right? And again, I want to emphasize this, right? I don't want you to walk away from this saying, Dave said, say racist things, it's going to be awesome, right? No. Let's keep having those should discussions, but don't stop there. My God, there's more ground to cover here, right? Because if all we ever do is say, okay, you shouldn't have said that, okay, did you get it? Okay, don't say that. All you can hope for, the best you can hope for, is a bureaucracy, right? I'd like to say something. Let me fill out this form. Am I saying it right? Okay, good. I'm going to say it. Okay, thanks. Like, that's the best case scenario. Another very big problem with the should-oriented conversation around race is this. This is probably the wackiest cognitive bias in history. And find me afterwards and say, Dave, tell me more about reactants, and I'll tell you how crazy this particular bias is. But this is the you can't tell me what to do bias, right? And it's especially prevalent in America. Like, that might as well be our logo, right? You can't tell me what to do. If you put up a sign that says, do not write on this wall, go to another wall and write a sign that says, under no circumstances should you write on this wall. Guess which wall is going to get more writing, right? You can't say that word. You shouldn't use that language. Wash, rinse, repeat. Do that enough times, guess what I really want to do more than anything? Guess what I want to do more than I wanted to before you told me not to do it? This, as much as anything, predicts the current state of politics, right? This is the other end of that pendulum swing, reactance to PC. This is why Nazis are a thing again. So what can we do, right? Spend a lot of time here kind of outlaying the problem, but if I'm being true to my word here, we should not stop there. So it turns out there's actually a lot we can do. One of the things we can start doing is calling out good behavior, right? We're really good at calling out the things that we thought were terrible. Let's start calling out the things we think are awesome. Let's talk about, hey, what were the best online conversations I saw last year? Where's that top 10 list, right? And the second you do something like that, right, the second you're going to have people saying, oh, well, I want to be on that list. I'm going to start having awesome conversations. I'm going to start leaving great comments. We are competitive. It's just a question of what you make us competitive over. And generally speaking, if you celebrate something, you will see more of it. So this was my lame attempt at that. Last year, I created a hashtag called Woke Cinema, where once a day I would post a movie that I thought could make you less racist, could make you less sexist, right? Like, maybe I could just create the content that I was looking for. And as you can tell, if you actually Google that or look up that hashtag, nobody picked it up. So it was not successful. But at least I started the conversation. I started the list. I've got the list now, right? And I can start celebrating those things. Let's talk about tools that we can provide for good behavior. Not just rules like do say this, don't say that, but let's talk about how we get people to talk about race and gender. So one of those tools already exists. It's called civil comments, and it's extremely clever. What it does is to plug in for your comment section where before you get to post your comment, you have to rate, I think, 3 other comments. Now think about what that does. First, it forces you to admit there's such a thing as a good or a bad comment. This is very important. Second, it forces you to apply your own standard. Now the power of applying your own standard is immeasurable. This is how powerful it is when you apply your own standard. They did a study out of Harvard to see what interventions could keep people from cheating on tests. And they looked at everything, right? Do we have cameras there? Is someone literally standing over you? Like, what do you do? The thing that did the most damage, right, that reduced cheating by far, was signing a pledge saying, I will not cheat on this test. That was it. Because you will hold yourself to the standard you set for yourself far more than the standard somebody else comes up with, right? So I go and I rate these comments, and I rate one good or rate one bad. And then when I rated bad, I look back at my comment and I see, wait, the thing that I said was bad about this comment, ooh, let me fix that. That actually happened. The majority of people who rated comments went back, changed their comment before they posted it. In a similar vein, and this is a 14-year-old who figured this out, so y'all got no excuse. Trisha Prabhu figures out, hey, I am sick of everything I'm seeing about cyberbullying. I'm going to create this thing called Rethink. And all it is, it's so simple. You are about to post something horrible, right? You have an algorithm that basically says, hey, I can tell this is something pretty terrible. It's likely this is terrible. When you try to hit post, before it actually posts, a little pop-up says, huh, it looks like that thing you were about to post might be hurtful. Are you sure you want to post it? That's it. That's all it does. 90% of the people who saw that intervention didn't post. That's it. That's all it took. Now this tells us a couple things. One, most of the people out there aren't evil, they're just thoughtless. It doesn't even occur to them that there's a human being on the other end of that tweet. Two, it only takes 2 sentences to stop them. We've been sitting here lamenting, oh my God, the state of social media, oh my God, the state of discourse. There's nothing we can do. Facebook, there's nothing we can do. We're going to stop showing you news. Like, it is intractable. 2 sentences. These are the kinds of interventions we can start putting together. Another thing that we can think about is asking better questions, right? The way we frame those questions has a big impact on what kind of conversation we have. So I was reading some article about how people who are really rich tend to index for happiness about the same as people who are fairly poor. And it would be easy to sort of do a post about that saying, oh, these stupid rich people, they're not even happy with their wealth, what idiots. And you get a lot of people saying, yeah, you're right, or yeah, you're stupid, whatever, right? That'd be an easy post. Instead I thought, that's kind of weird actually, right? Because, you know, more money, more problems, but at the same time, I don't think you're happy or having no problems. Is there actually an ideal amount of money to make? That was a more interesting question to me. It was a way more interesting question to the others, and it made for a more interesting conversation. By the way, the answer is $75,000 a year. Problem solved. So let's go back to the conversion. Part of their secret sauce is they know how to ask the right question. They have to get people from opposite sides of an issue to come together to the table. And part of the way they do it is how they phrase the question. So let's say the issue is food deserts. This might seem a natural question to ask. How can we get healthier food into the supermarket? The problem is, even though this doesn't sound divisive, it's actually pretty divisive. It's going to get hard to get some marketers to come to the table here. It's going to get hard to get some financiers to come to the table here. So what you ask instead is, how can we work together to shift consumer demand to healthier consumption? Now you see what they did there? Shift consumer demand. If I'm a marketer, right, or if I sell food, already I'm like, oh, shift consumer demand. That means that there's a white space out there. There's a market I haven't tapped yet. Yes, tell me more. How can I help? Right? And healthier consumption, well, that was already on the table, right? So if I'm interested in health and healthier outcomes for people, okay, now I'm at the table. Now these two people who are suddenly divided can both see themselves in the question. And there's one other little trick in that question. Can you see it? How can we work together, right? Stop there. You cannot answer this question without agreeing to work together. Whatever solution you come with, one of the requirements is we are working together. Let's go back to our original question. How might this person drive this car? It's a fine enough question in and of itself, but it kind of misses the point. What about how do we do a better job of moving people, right? I mean, that's why the guy was in the car in the first place. He didn't get in the car unless he wants to go somewhere. The problem wasn't whether he's not in the car. The problem was he's here, he wants to be there. How do we get him there? Let's have that conversation. If we have that conversation, all of a sudden, public transportation is on the table, right? All these other things might be considered that we'd have to throw out otherwise. Let's also think beyond comments, right? If it's not a good tool for having a discussion, what is? Last year, NPR said, you know what, we're done. We're just not going to do comments anymore. But it was not a capricious decision, right? It was not a, oh, you know what, I'm just going to throw in the towel. We're not going to have people talk to each other anymore. No. This is how many other things they had going on successfully before they decided to shut down comments. The reason they shut down comments is all of these other things were way better ways for people to talk to each other and to talk to NPR. Why keep comments going if this is working so well? Let's also talk about platforms for better conversations, right? So we'll do what we can with Facebook and Twitter, but what about all new platforms? How many people here know what GitHub is? Okay, a fair amount. So very low-level explanation for the uninitiated, and I am not a coder, so you are definitely getting the layman's version of this, but basically it is a code repository, right? I want to create code, I want to write code, I want to build something, but I want to do it in a way where you can also contribute to what I'm writing. And you can contribute in a way that's not going to mess up what I'm doing. And again, there's a very fun story behind this, I'll tell you later, but it's a way to collaboratively work on a thing, right? It's that contributing thing, right? Not, hey, let's fight each other over the code. No, let's work together, right? How can we do this for conversation? How can we do this for coming up with solutions? It moves around. So here's the difference. Yeah, if GitHub were Facebook, it would be a place where you go to criticize code, right? That's the difference. So this is an interesting, I'm blanking on the name of this. This is a new website called Kaya, I think. I will look it up later and post it. But basically, this is an attempt to start to map out conversations. right? So you basically create a seed kind of question like capital punishment should be abolished, right? And then people will make different points, and the green ones are pro and the red ones are con, and you can kind of see how the conversation lays out over time. It's kind of an interesting approach, but it still misses the point a bit in terms of we're still just having the argument, we're just mapping it out a little better. I want to get to something a little closer to this, right? Right now we can have a binary reaction or a however many faces there are reaction to things we see on Facebook, right? But it's still this sort of singular point, right? What if there was a, hey, I want to work on this button. I want to actually come up with an idea. And what would that button do? Well, in the real world, it might do this. So as a part of my job, I will often run design sessions where I get a bunch of people in a room to say, hey, let's come up with an idea. And this is how we do it. Let's say it's 8 people, and ideally 8 fairly diverse people with different backgrounds. And let's say the problem we're trying to solve is, how might we make it easier to find and hire more female directors? 8 people in a room, I say, okay, you 8 people, you have 3 minutes to write down 3 ideas for how we might find more female directors. You do it, 3 minutes are up, say, great. I want you to show your 3 ideas to your neighbor. They will show you their 3 ideas. You will take those 6 ideas, whittle them down to 2. Go. Time's up. Take your 2 ideas, show them to the pair next to you. They will show you their 2 ideas. Take those 4 ideas, whittle them down to 2. And you can see where this is going, right? By the end, we've got 8 people, 4 ideas. Take those 4 ideas, whittle them down to 1. And this is a tried and true scientific approach to coming up with good ideas. Because what they found out was, if I were to tell those 8 people, go off, come up with ideas, we'll vote on the best one, we'll get a mediocre idea. If I were to say, hey, 8 people, I'm going to lock you in a room, you don't get out until you've agreed on one idea, mediocre idea. But if you combine those approaches, what you get is the DNA of those people's lived experiences filtered through and combined into that one idea. And this is literally $1 million approach. How many people remember when Netflix said, we will give you $1 million if you can make our algorithm, research recommendation algorithm like 1% better? So this was a thing. And a lot of teams came out and tried to win that $1 million prize. The winning team was a combination of 2 or 3 different teams. We each had a piece of the puzzle, but when they came together, we were able to come up with that one great idea. So I would love to do this online, digitally, right? Get people in the room to do this. How do we actually do this for people who aren't able to meet, right? Or who see that thing on Facebook that's supposed to make them angry, but instead makes them want to solve or start coming up with ideas. And by the way, literally I'm asking this, right? You're people, very smart people in this room. Some of them know how to code, some of them know how to create ideas. Some of them are just smart. Start working on this if you so feel inspired. Now, we have some guidance from fandom. Fandom has been coming up with ideas collaboratively for a very, very long time, since before there was internet, right? And there's all sorts of interesting ways they do it. So this is an example actually from Twitter, although it happens a little more often on Tumblr. How many people are familiar with the song Eleanor Rigby? Right, you roughly know how it goes. Okay, so someone posted this, dog in a trench coat getting promoted at work, but then sheds his disguise, canine surprise. And that's all they posted, by the way. People just saw that and just picked up on it. Verse after verse after verse, all about things disguised as other things in a workplace. It is awesome. I advise you to go look it up, right? But this is the source code. This is the fork, right? These are all the different things people do. And then someone took their favorite verses and actually recorded it. So there is a version, a parody, Eleanor would be out there with a lot of these lyrics in it, right? Now, if I were to play that for you, you would say, oh, one smart person sat down and wrote that. No, that is absolutely not what happened. People got together, understood the rules of the game very quickly, and figured out how to contribute their ideas. Now, solving world hunger is a little more complicated than this, but the collaboration model, the actual engine for it, is there. Same thing here, and this is the wackiest, but most amazing version of it. So I highly encourage you to look up a talk called Fan is a Tool Using Animal. The very short version is that there was this site called Delicious, and people were using this site to tag their fan fiction. And when I say tag, I mean meticulous, data-oriented, metadata, richer than anything you have seen, like even on a medical website, right? Super well structured. And they're able to do this because Delicious had really good functionality for that. Then Yahoo bought Delicious. Can anybody guess what happened next? They stripped out all that functionality. Now, the guy who founded Pinboard said, all you folks who are losing that functionality, I'm kind of building a thing that's going to have that. Why don't you tell me what you want? Hit me up on Twitter. And they did. They did so much. It was like, whoa, 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 fire hose. Just what? Stop. That's too much. Let's do a Google Doc instead. And what you see here are just a scant few of the pages they created. They created something like 300 pages in 2 days. And it is the most amazing requirements document you've ever seen in your life. Because not only did they collaborate and very quickly create rules of order and go here to see if this is a feature that's already been requested yet. If it hasn't, go here. They had that whole infrastructure crowdsourced in like a day. And then they started documenting exactly what needed to happen. And then it got to the point where he would go in and start responding to why he couldn't do a particular feature. And then before he hit send, someone would post, oh, I fixed it. That, my friends, is collaboration online from multiple sources. So I believe the tools are there. It's just a question of finding the right mix. Another thing we can start to do is to use design language for things other than design. So this is a pretty typical user story that you use if you're building out a feature. As a blank, I would like to blank so that I can blank, right? And Comcast uses this all the time. Big companies use this, small companies use this, right, to design features, right? So on iTunes, as an iTunes listener, I would like to recommend songs so that I can feel smart, whatever it is, right? But this paradigm doesn't just work for features on a phone. As a woman, I would like to be paid as much as a man so that I can pay off my student loans. This is a way to think about a problem and apply really tried and true methods of problem solving to something that doesn't usually get the attention it deserves. Right here in Philly, we've started doing a version of this. So problems-based procurement is a completely different approach for how we do things in city life. So typically, if you had to, say, replace all your streetlights, because your streetlights are outdated, you need new streetlights. What you would do is you would say, okay, here is a 50-page document with all the requirements for what these streetlights need to look like, the wattage they have to be at, how much they need to cost, boom, 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 boom. Lowest bidder of maybe like 4 different bidders comes in and gets the job, right? And you get a slightly less crappy version of the streetlights you had one generation before. Problems-based procurement says, we need to be able to see at night. Go. That's it. Now, any solution that actually gets the job done is on the table. If it turns out giving everybody night vision goggles is the best way to do it, that's what we're going to do, right? And anyone gets to play, right? I don't have to just worry about those 4 vendors I keep going to. No, if you come up with the idea, great, you got the job. And you get better solutions because you're describing the problem, not the solution. Design approaches in general can get us further. And these are approaches that have been used for decades and decades. But we just tend not to use them when we're talking about helping us out in social situations, right, or in the city. But before the basics of design thinking, if anyone's seen anyone use the term design thinking, human-centered design, it basically boils down to a very simple principle. If you are going to build something for somebody, talk to them first. That's it. Like, I've just made all of you design thinkers. If you can remember that, right? Everything else is just tool sets. So, and the thing is, this is not new for design thinking. Back in 2010, I read a document called the IDEO Human Factors Toolkit. And this is probably the best design document in history, or one of them. And it's basically outlining all the sort of steps you take in good human-centered design. But they're doing it not to design the mouse, not to design a new car. No, they went to a village in Africa. And before they tried to recommend solution 1, they lived there and talked to people and became a part of the community. And then they were able to see, oh, you might need this, you might need that, and you might need it this way, and not that way, and that way. So we've been thinking about design thinking as a way to help the poor, to help the underprivileged, to help the people who don't usually get help, and at this point can't afford that level of help, right? That was its birth, right? We've kind of lost our way to the point where now when we think of design thinking, we think, oh, that's something for rich people. That was never the intention. So back in the 80s, Eric Bogosian writes talk radio about an actual radio DJ in Texas, this very boisterous, angry man. But one of the climactic speeches is, marvelous technology is at our disposal, and instead of reaching up for new heights, we try to see how far down we can go, right? Now, he was talking about radio, but this kind of feels like the present moment. So if we're going to reach those heights, I'm going to recommend these rules for productive discourse. So before you enter into that discussion, make sure that both of you agree to these 3 things. 1, neither of us has the answer, right? This takes a little bit of humility, but it's necessary. If you think you have the answer, the discussion's already over. What are we discussing, right? And here's the thing. If you had the answer, right, we wouldn't need to have this discussion, right? Neither of us will win. And again, you gotta check your ego at the door. You're not going to go into this discussion in order to make yourself feel good, right? This needs to be about coming up with a solution or getting closer to one. Because here's the thing, you're not there to win. And winning isn't going to actually help. All winning is going to do is make you feel good about yourself for a little while until the same problem you didn't solve rears its ugly head again because you were too busy winning to solve it. And finally, we're here to create something new, right? And this assumes the best in each other, right? This assumes that we both have something to contribute that's something that didn't exist before, because again, if it existed already, we wouldn't need to have this discussion. So the next time you see somebody doing it wrong, ask yourself if there is a how conversation to be had. Thank you. So are there any questions?
I'm sort of wondering how you know and what you want to have is a productive discourse. You talked earlier about, there are some people who are maybe malicious versus ignorant. Do I want to have a productive conversation with a Nazi? I don't know that that's the solution. I'm just curious about your thoughts there.
Sure, and it kind of depends on your level of patience, honestly. So Sarah Silverman, I don't know if anyone saw this interaction on Twitter, it was kind of amazing. Sarah Silverman lately has been doing some really interesting work about just that sort of thing. She has a show where she just goes and talks to people all around the country about hot button issues and just has a conversation. And you already know where she's coming from politically, right? That's not really a mystery. But in the course of this, someone just basically calls her the worst word you can call a woman on Twitter. And her response, after a moment, right, is really thoughtful and starts this conversation around when she finds out this person, just by looking at their Twitter stream, that's the first thing he does, looks them up on Twitter, just looks at what they've had to say in the past. And discovers things like they've had chronic pain, they've had like these family and abuse issues and all these things, and says, she basically comes at them with a place of compassion and says, I understand that you're going through a lot of pain right now, and just very slowly starts to unpack what he's going through. And he starts to soften as he goes until finally he's like, yeah, I'm sorry, I've been going through so much lately and all this stuff. Now, that takes an incredible amount of patience, right, on the part of Sarah Silverman to say, you know what, I am going to take time out of my day to actually go through and figure out what's going on, or at least take a guess, right? But she's decided it is worth it for her to spend her time doing that. So I think that is a very individual choice, right? I can tell you one thing, I probably wouldn't have responded at all, right? And if I had, it probably would have been very vitriolic, right? Like that's, the nature that would have caused. If they'd used a certain word with me, right? Like I probably would have been like, I don't need to have this conversation. That is a perfectly valid choice. I think just as it takes a certain skill set to talk about race, it takes a certain skill set to train how to talk about race. And I think she probably has it. I don't think I do. But I don't think you need to feel obligated, right, to say, okay, you have to. You just have to engage in this person.
I have to. For the collaborative problem solving on a digital basis, when you have that many people coming in to give ideas, given the society we're in, who claims the end result?
That excellent question. So many ways to approach that. So first off, to the problem of the number of people. This exercise works really well in multiples of 8. Like the numbers actually matter, right? So you can't just throw it open to 50 people and say, go, right? You do actually need to kind of like filter down and say, okay, you want to talk about this problem? All right, I'm gonna put you in this room with 7 other people, go, right? And by room I mean just like the chat room, whatever it's gonna be. Like you would have to think carefully about what are the right numbers for mindset. Because there is actually some math around this. Wisdom of crowds, it's kind of, it's not really outdated, it's just sort of like, the term has been abused, but the actual book Wisdom of Crowds has a lot of interesting data about this. And 150 is roughly the number you want to get to before you just have to break off into another group and you just can't get anything done anymore. So there is actually a little math that goes into saying, okay, this is about the size. Now, as far as claiming the solution, if you look at the open source movement, that's kind of anathema, right? The idea is that no one owns the solution, it's information. If it helps me, great, let's use it, right? If I come up with a method for making school lunches more affordable, right? I don't own that. It's, from a philosophical, cultural standpoint in that world, it's almost wrong to own that. It's kind of like, no, we need to get this solution out to as many people as possible. It would be akin to saying I cured polio, but you know what? I'm not going to tell you about it, right? It's like, no, you have to get that out there. Everybody needs to know this. So, is that kind of what you meant by owning the solution?
Well, just looking at that, practically speaking, you know, a lot of times when people, I was talking to somebody about volunteering for something, and said, oh, is that a paid position? So this could very well, if it's something that really hit a milestone that was looked for by society or something, somebody's gonna want to talk about it. And then, when everybody has contributed, you know, I could just see it.
Oh, totally, right? So what would probably happen to this, right? It would probably exist as this open source thing, because this is what happened to MP3s. So when we first started sharing music online digitally, we did it with the MP3 format, which is open source. Nobody owns MP3 as a format, because the people who created it said, we're not going to make that a thing. Now, Apple came along and created a different format, a proprietary format. And they basically said, if you want to play in our ecosystem, buy music from this platform, you are locked into this platform. This format will not play on any other device, right? They're going to lock you in. MP3 still exists, but it's in this sort of open web format, and it's not as user-friendly. So the way they get you is with user-friendliness, right? Facebook is there. And it is a relatively user-friendly way to stay in touch with people. It has all this cool functionality. So is texting, right? And what's funny about it is, and I wonder how much of this is going to be generational. So there was a panel last year about Gen Z, right? Just literally a bunch of 13-year-olds, right, sitting there telling you about their lives. And for a long time, I've been thinking about something that, like in our name, what comes to me. This writer is talking about how one of the fundamental problems with Facebook is no one wants to be in a room with everyone they know. Because everyone they know includes their mom and their boyfriend and their friend from school. And it's like, I don't want them all in the same room, right? So if I post a comment or like a response to something that I want my friends to comment on, and then my sister comments on it, I'm like, no, that wasn't for you. So there's this fundamental problem there that Facebook still hasn't really figured out. And she was sort of, and I started thinking, whoever figures that out, a way for me to really just target who I want to target in a friction-free environment. Then this Gen Z panel comes along, and the 13-year-olds are talking about, so I used to go to this other school, and I had a lot of friends, but then when I went to this new school, I met a lot of really cool new friends, and I was like, they would really like my old friends. So I started a text chat. And I'm like, oh, right, the solution has been there since the smartphone was invented, right? So that's a long way of getting around to saying, if these solutions stay low tech enough, it's probably not going to matter if someone tries to own it. Someone probably will. I think it's an excellent point. And they'll probably make a decent amount of money on it, but it's not going to stop the conversation. And in fact, I wonder if, generationally speaking, there's going to be a sort of starting to skew away from things that are too proprietary, especially when things like just texting exist. So yeah, so probably both, I guess is the answer to my question. You will have people who will want to own that. And they'll make some money off it. But I think that there's going to be another population, just like you have now with open source populations, that trade in more free information.
Do you think that if there was such a platform that was widely adopted, it would attract sort of a self-selected people of a certain cognitive bias? You know, like all of us who are really open-minded and considerate and kind.
So, everyone is biased, open-minded or not. And part of the problem, so this is the curse of studying bias, is you find out very quickly that even when you're aware of a bias, you keep doing the bias. It is scary how pernicious it is. There are literally experiments where people will say, hey, there's this cognitive bias we're studying, and we think that if we say these numbers before asking you a question, it'll change your answer. I'm telling you that now, so don't change your answer. We tell you the numbers. We ask you the question. You changed your answer. There's even situations where we will give you monetary incentives and say, we will pay you money if you don't fall for this bias. I changed my answer. Like, that's how powerful it is. There's literally a bias called the bias blind spot. That's all about how we don't know our own biases. Like, so I don't think it's escapable. I don't think you're ever going to have a bias-free version of this, which is why, and I kind of ran through this quickly, but that line about make sure those 8 people are diverse and have different life experiences, that's why that is crucial. Right? So if I get 8 people in a room who basically have the same amount of privilege, the solution they come up with is probably going to cater to that privilege, right? It will probably be really good for people who have the same amount of privilege. If, however, I put people in that room who are coming from very different backgrounds, that solution is probably going to be more flexible. It's probably going to be more resilient because it'll bear out in a lot more use cases because somewhere along that chain, someone who didn't have privilege saw the idea from the person who did have privilege and say, you know that idea is only going to work if you have privilege, right? Oh, okay, we need to tweak it, right? So it's catching it before it finally gets to that final point. So I would say, if you're building that system, try to find a way to optimize for diversity, right? And if it's like a big sorting room, right? And it's like, okay, we're going to pick 8 people to talk about this problem. However I can tag that, which is its own problematic thing. But if I have a way of tagging who's coming from a different background, let's make sure that I'm not putting 8 of the same people in the same room.
So if you're trying to facilitate a conversation about some systemic issue with lots of nuance and details and circumstances, and you've got folks at the table who have dug in on the position of, oh, so-and-so is just an idiot or this group is stupid, do you have any techniques that can be used to help break through that?
So, yes, don't invite the ones who are already like it, right? So there's a certain degree to which if we can't agree to those 3 rules, we probably can't have the conversation. Now there's a whole other conversation on, well, how do I get you to the point where you're ready to agree to those rules? And that I know less about. That's a whole other project, right? And a very worthy project. But to get to this point, I kind of need you in a place where you're willing to say, I'm stupid. Or at least there are things I'm stupid about. Like if you can't have that level of self-awareness, I can't make you, right? Like you're not going to play by the rules, right? Which is not to say you necessarily need these rules exactly to have that 8-up exercise. That actually has a lot more to do with the context and the way you phrase the question. Because one of the problems and one of the caveats here around using that exercise is it helps if the question is fairly specific. So I recently did a version of this around the issue of the refugee crisis in Philadelphia. And the idea was to get some design thinkers like myself who are kind of well-versed in that world, but then people who work with refugees or are refugees, and get us all, so for the 8 people, 4 of us were in that design world, and 4 of us were in that working with the ground truth world, and say, hey, if we could work together, can we come up with something useful? That was the experiment. And one of the things we had to do pretty early on, we had someone basically talk about, okay, here are all the different challenges facing refugees in Philadelphia. And as you might imagine, there are quite a few, right? But then we have to pick. That's the key, right? We have to focus in on one problem, one challenge that was small enough to give us room to breathe and come up with ideas, but not so big, it's like, make refugees' lives better, right? So the level of detail we got to was how might we do a better job of finding housing for refugees in Philadelphia? It's just small enough where, okay, housing, let's really focus in on the different aspects of housing in Philadelphia. but not so big as to say, okay, well, there's a lot of challenges facing refugees. Which one? What do you want to take? What do you want to take? Right? That level of focusing kind of helps, right? So whatever position you're dug in on starts to become irrelevant, because unless it actually bears on answering the question, I didn't ask you how you feel about refugees in Philadelphia. I asked you how would you do a better job of finding housing for somebody, right?